Alright, I'm here in the San Antonio firewall, and I just wanted to show before we push the configuration from Panorama, none of the interfaces are defined. Additionally, if we go to the virtual router, we can see here that it's just a default virtual router with nothing configured, and there are no zones. Let's check the Portland router. Again, the interfaces have nothing configured. If I click on zones, we can see there are no zones, and for virtual routers, nothing has been configured as well. So let's jump back over to Panorama and finally push all of the configurations that we've been working on throughout this module. So I'm going to go to the commit button, and you can see here that it's a blue rectangle with a green square, which means the configuration has been saved to Panorama, but it has yet to be pushed to the devices. So I'm finally going to click that push to devices button. All right, here we can see the push scope. And as you can see, we're working with a global remote office stack, since that's the only two firewalls that are connected to Panorama right now. But let's take a closer look. If I click on Edit Selections, by default, it takes us into device groups. We're not working with device groups in this module, so I'm going to jump to the Templates tab. And then we can see here both of our firewalls. Additionally, we can see the last commit state. And since we have yet to push the configuration to the devices, it just shows that it's out of sync. And if you want to preview the changes to see what's going to change on the firewall before you push, you can do that here. Before I click OK and then push these changes, I wanted to show you one more thing. By default, the firewalls are able to override the template values that are configured in Panorama. But if we wanted to, we could force Panorama to use its template values and overwrite what's on the local firewall. If we click this checkbox, we're going to get a giant warning from Palo Alto saying that this potentially could bring down the network. Even though these firewalls are not in production yet, and we do want to start from scratch, I don't want to have Panorama force the template values. Additionally, if I don't do this, it will allow me to show you how to override the template values from the local firewall itself. So for now, this all looks good, so I'll click OK, and then I'll click Push. All right, with a push, it goes a lot quicker. So we can see here that the commit all has changed from 100% to active. So let's jump over to the firewall. We'll go to the San Antonio firewall first. And if we click on tasks, we can see here that it's doing a commit, and it's from Panorama with the user of Kinda logged in. Let's jump over to the Portland firewall to take a look at its tasks. All right, we can see the same thing. Okay, it looks like the commit was successfully completed. If I click on the commit all, there's some information that I wanted to point out. The first is that every time a firewall receives an update from Panorama, it performs a connectivity check that it can still reach Panorama. Maybe the firewall is using something like a data plane interface for communication with Panorama, and if we were to push a rule in place that would prevent it from talking with Panorama, then it would be unreachable. If that's the case, and the firewall is ever unreachable to Panorama once an update is pushed, it will actually revert back to the old changes and show as a fail. Additionally, you can see here that Ethernet 1.1 through 1.6 has no virtual router configured. But that's kind of weird because we configured that in the previous clip. So let's take a closer look. If I close out of this, and jump over to interfaces, we can see Ethernet 1.1 through 1.6 has been pushed from Panorama, but there is no virtual router associated with any of these interfaces. And I'll show you why that is in a bit. But first, you can see here that there's a green sprocket next to each interface. If we hover over that, we can see which template stack pushed this information. So let's jump over to the zones. There we go. Here's our zones that we configured in the previous clip as well. So let's jump back over to the virtual routers and see why the interfaces are not using the default virtual router, which we configured in the previous clip. All right, you can see here that the sprocket icon is green and orange. This means that the local firewall has overridden the values that were pushed from Panorama. In this case, that's because there was already a default virtual router that was in place before Panorama pushed the configuration. So I'll select the default router, and then down at the bottom, click Revert, which is going to revert back to the settings pushed from Panorama. So I'll click Yes. All right, and once that's done, you can see here that the interfaces are now added to this virtual router. So the last step that we need to do is to commit these changes. And the only thing that we're really committing is that this firewall should not override the values from the virtual router. Rather, use those same values from Panorama. So click Commit, and then commit again. And we're going to go ahead and do the same thing on the San Antonio router. Again, if we take a look at the commit settings, Everything looks good, but again, Ethernet 1.1 through 1.6 have no virtual router configured, so I'll close out of this. Jump back over to virtual routers, and then select the default virtual router, and then click revert. Yes, I do. Okay, let's go ahead and commit these changes. And then now let's jump back over to the Portland firewall. All right, looks like the commit was successful. And again, the firewall did perform a connectivity check to Panorama to make sure that it's connected, which it still is. So we're all good to go. So I'll close out of this. And then let's verify our settings. If we go back to interfaces, we can see here that the Portland firewall is using all the correct IP addresses for Ethernet 1.1 through 1.6. And again, that's easy to tell because it's using 22 as a second octet for all of the IP addresses, with the exception of Ethernet 1.6, and we can also see that each interface is assigned to the default router. And if we jump back over to the San Antonio firewall, all right, that commit was successful. And just a spot check, let's check the static route on this one too. So if I click default and then click static routes, all right, and here in the static route, we can see that the value is 192.168.255.1/32, which is exactly what we want for the San Antonio firewall. Let's close out of this and jump back over to interfaces just to be sure. And again, we can see that this firewall is receiving all the correct IP addresses since 21 is the second octet. And again, if you ever need to override a setting on the local firewall, you would just select the object that you want to override and then click override and then go into the configuration just like you normally would on the firewall. The last thing I wanted to show you was the Panorama commit settings. So if we go over to Device tab and then click on the Panorama settings, we have enabled the automatic commit recovery, which is on by default. And if it fails, it's only going to attempt to contact Panorama one time. But if we wanted to check Panorama connectivity multiple times, we can set the interval between retries. All right, that's everything that I wanted to teach you in this module. So what are the key takeaways that you should remember? The first is to plan your network and firewall deployments. As you saw, since the remote office firewalls follow the same layout, we were able to use similar settings and not have to go through and configure each setting from scratch. And of course, this won't work for all situations. Like in Global Mantix's network, the configurations for the internet gateway firewalls are much different than the data center firewalls. But what if you have a larger organization with multiple sites? So maybe each of these sites, they have their own internet gateway firewalls. And what if you have multiple data centers that have their own data center firewalls? Something to think about is if you could plan those out in similar fashion to help you group things better nicely. Of course, it won't be a perfect one-to-one for each site. There are going to be different settings that come up. That's not a big deal because as you saw, it's pretty easy to override a value, either pushed from a higher template or override the value on the firewall itself. And again, this course isn't designed to go in depth on how to configure everything. Rather, this course is designed to show you how to leverage Panorama. But the way that I like to think about it, when you're configuring settings in Panorama, it's pretty much the same thing as configuring those same settings if I'm on the local firewall. You're just doing it in a different place. And this leads me to my last point. Remember which template or template stack that you're in. If I'm being honest, there have been times where I was moving too quickly making changes and forgetting to change the template to the one that I was wanting to configure. So just take a breath, slow down, and keep working at it. All right, in the next module, you'll see how to configure objects and policies to push to devices by using Panorama's device groups.